Hello and welcome to Beta64 Minis, where I discuss the complete known development of a video game in less than 8 minutes. Today we're going to be talking about Donkey Kong Racing, an unreleased GameCube sequel to Diddy Kong Racing. So what do you say? Let's begin. After Diddy Kong Racing's release in November of 1997, Rare began work on the game's sequel, Donkey Kong Racing, for the Nintendo GameCube. Years passed, and at E3 2001, the game was shown off to the public for the first time, with an impressive pre-rendered teaser video. This video shows off some of the areas that were going to be present in the game, with Donkey Kong and his pals riding through them on various animals. These pals include Taj the Genie from Diddy Kong Racing, Diddy Kong himself, as well as Tiny Kong and Kiddy Kong. While these characters were the only ones that appeared in the trailer, a render that we have here shows that both Cranky Kong and Lanky Kong were also planned to be playable at some point too. Now, you probably have noticed at least one big departure from Diddy Kong Racing. Instead of driving carts, planes, and hovercrafts, they're riding familiar animals from the Donkey Kong universe. Rambi the Rhino, Ungar the Swordfish, Espresso the Ostrich, and Zingers, as well as some other presumably rideable characters that are pictured here. Going back, I want you to take a look at the beginning of the footage, paying close attention to these rhinos that DK, Taj, and Diddy Kong are riding. Notice the size difference between them. That's not just some random thing, that was a feature of the game. By collecting food and prizes from races, you could turn your animals into what the press release calls true thoroughbreds. In other words, collecting items in the game allows you to upgrade your animals in order to make them better in races. Some other features of the game were also described in the same press release too, like ride through a blooming jungle scenery teeming with wildlife of all kinds, and experience real-world phenomena like fading sunlight, shifting shadows, swaying trees, etc. Overall, it sounds like the areas in this game were going to look beautiful. In fact, these areas weren't only going to look great, but they were also going to be stitched together into a huge, seamless world, where the lines between the tracks and the environments were blurred. In Rare's own words, it's your job to pick out the racing line amidst those marauding rhinos, hungry piranha, and seething wasps, if you can. In order to adapt to the changing terrain, you could also have changed the animal that you were riding midway through the race, because, as a former Rare staff employee mentioned, animals had different properties depending on what they were. Bigger animals could smash through obstacles, while smaller ones were much more maneuverable. Falling off your animal was also a thing in this game, and you would have had to repeatedly tap a button in order to get back on and continue racing. In addition to the variety of animals and a big, beautiful world, there was also going to be an amazing orchestrated soundtrack, with everything being played back in Dolby Digital surround sound. Basically, Rare was going out of their way to make this world as realistic as possible. At least as realistic as you can get with a bunch of apes riding swordfish. With this game's release set sometime in 2002, everyone was excited to hear more about Donkey Kong Racing at Space World 2001, or perhaps even ECTS later in September. But it never appeared. Never again. In fact, the development of the game didn't even continue after this point. During that time, Rare was going through some small changes. Game development had been getting more expensive as time went on, and Nintendo wasn't providing the company with the capital needed to keep going. So, Rare's founders, Tim and Chris Stamper, offered the remaining 51% of their company to Nintendo for purchase. However, much to their surprise, Nintendo turned down the offer, and so they went out in search of another potential buyer. Activision and Microsoft were both interested in purchasing the company. However, Microsoft won the battle over Rare thanks to the $375 million they paid for it in 2002. Obviously, at this point, it was impossible for the team to keep developing Donkey Kong Racing, as they no longer worked with Nintendo and didn't have permission to use the characters. The team didn't want their game to go to waste though, so they started reworking it for Xbox using an older IP of Rare's, or should I say, an older IP of Ultimate Play the Game. Sabrewolf. These games came out for the ZX Spectrum in the 80s, but Sabreman himself has made an appearance in other Rare games too, like Banjo-Tooie. In 2003, Microsoft trademarked the name Sabreman Stampede for the game's title, and in March of 2004, when asked if Rare was still working on Donkey Kong Racing, they said, and I quote, "Well, yes and no. It's not called Donkey Kong Racing anymore, it's not for the GameCube anymore, and by this point I'd imagine so little of the original art and code remains that it's barely even the same game anymore. But yes, it's still coming out in some form." But it wasn't still coming out, because in late 2004, 2 other rare games, Cameo and Perfect Dark Zero, were being ported from the Xbox to the 360. And because the Cameo team didn't have enough people on hand to do this, the team working on Sabreman Stampede were recruited. Fun fact, if you look at the credits part of the Cameo manual and look under special thanks, you'll notice that the Stampede team is mentioned. In order to help Cameo though, the Stampede team had to put their game on hold, despite the fact that they were already in the middle of porting Sabreman Stampede to the 360 as well. 6 years later, the game was officially cancelled. But why? Well, according to Lee Musgrave, even though the team felt that they had a great Xbox prototype of the game, someone, somewhere, decided that it was too old school for the Xbox. Too old school? Too old school? Anyway, slowly but surely, they were told to keep making changes and evolving the game, until eventually it wasn't even the same game they started with. And quietly, our last hope of playing Donkey Kong Racing in some form died. But that wasn't the end. In 2008, someone posted footage of an early prototype of Sabreman Stampede, and we finally got to see what our beloved Donkey Kong Racing became. It became something completely, unexpectedly different. Instead of being a racer, the game had been transformed into a 3D platforming adventure. However, despite being so different, there are some similar ideas between the two cancelled games. Sabreman rides animals much like Donkey Kong and his friends did, and these animals also vary in size, speed, and maneuverability. Plus, you could also switch between the animals in the middle of riding them, much like how Donkey Kong Racing was supposed to do the same thing. In order to ride an animal in Sabreman Stampede though, you would first have to shoot the animal with a rope gun, which was actually pretty controversial among the team for quote-unquote animal abuse. But now that you're attached, you have to avoid collisions and rotate your body until you reach the animal, and then just stay on it for a few seconds. At that point, it's yours to control. But what can you do with your newfound steed? Nothing much. I mean, you can knock over trees and destroy buildings, but in the footage, there's really no purpose to it. In fact, what on earth was supposed to be the objective of this game? Well, as it turns out, the story went a little like this. Sabreman and his wife Flo crash land on an island, and while on the island, it's your job to do tasks for villagers you meet and befriend, and by finding new animals, you'll be able to reach different places on the island. And that's really as far as it got. It sure is a lot different than Donkey Kong Racing, huh? And that's basically the reason it was cancelled. The severe lack of story, game progression, and barely anything resembling objectives is what drove this game into the grave. The team just lost focus on what the game was supposed to be. So it started out as an incredibly innovative racer, eventually lost what it was trying to achieve, and never came back. Well, I guess Sabreman himself did eventually come back and get his own game in 2004 for the Game Boy Advance, but it's still far from the racer that we had hoped for a long time. And so that's the tragic tale of Donkey Kong Racing. If you'd like to see how other rare games were created, check out full Beta64 episodes on Banjo-Tooie and Conker's Bad Fur Day. But until next time, this has been Beta64. Thanks for watching.